Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the State and Local Implementation Grant Program. My name is Brian Howard, and I'm a Legislative Associate with the National Congress of American Indians. NCAI will be hosting this webinar on behalf of NTIA to talk about the SLIG program and next steps for FirstNet implementation. I have on the line with me Laura Pettis, who is the program administrator for this program, and she will give a presentation on some background information on FirstNet and some of the programmatic requirements for the State and Local Implementation Grant Program. We will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please, if you want to, you can type them into the questions box, which will go directly towards me, and I can announce them towards the end of the presentation, and Ms. Pettis can respond. And then also at the end, we will be taking calls from the phone line. So if you have a question during that time, you can use the raise the hand option, and it will signal me to unmute your line. And we'll go ahead and start. Laura, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I guess.
Everyone's line is muted right now, so.
Okay, well, we'll get started. So thank you very much for having me today. We appreciate partnering with NCAI on this important topic to make sure that the different tribal nations are aware of this program as well as the grant program. I'm going to spend the majority of the time today discussing the State and Local Implementation Grant Program, but I want to just take a moment to provide a brief overview of the legislation. So on slide 2, there's some background. The Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 implements some of the key administrative priorities. It was enacted over a year ago, and it established the First Responder Network Authority, or FirstNet. And FirstNet is to establish a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network, and that is to be based on a single national network architecture. The Act also reallocated 700 megahertz from the D block spectrum for use by public safety entities, and the FCC has reallocated and granted a single license to FirstNet to use both the 700 megahertz D block as well as the existing public safety broadband spectrum. So that's 20 megahertz of contiguous spectrum, which is really important. The statute also requires substantial rural coverage milestones in the FirstNet deployment phases, which is an important component of the statute. And also, the law allocates $7 billion of future spectrum auction proceeds for this program. If you go to slide 2, I just have a little bit more information on FirstNet. The Act established FirstNet as an independent authority within NTIA. It's exempt from many of the requirements like the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Administrative Procedures Act, and the Regulatory Flexibility Act. FirstNet is headed by a 15-member board, which was appointed in August of last year. They hold the single public safety 700 megahertz wireless broadband license. And the Act requires them to take all actions necessary to ensure the design, construction, deployment, and operations of this nationwide public safety network. And as I mentioned, the statute requires substantial rural coverage milestones in each of the deployment phases of this network. So if we move to slide 4, as authorized under the Act, NTIA is required to establish the State and Local Implementation Grant Program, or what we affectionately like to call SLIG-P. It is a $135 million program to assist regional, state, tribal, and local governments to identify, plan, and implement the most efficient and effective way to integrate the existing infrastructure and equipment into the nationwide network. If you go to the next slide, slide 5, NTIA released the Federal Funding Opportunity Notice on February 6, 2013. The FFO opens the grant application window and describes the program requirements. All of the information on the program, the FFO, the supplemental application, frequently asked questions, they're all available on our website, which is listed on the slide. It's important to know that the application window closes on March 19th, which is 18 days away, so not much more time for states to apply. The grant period of performance will be 3 years. If you go to the next slide, I've outlined a timeline for the program. NTIA anticipates awarding all of the state and local implementation funds no later than July 15th. The award start dates will hopefully be, or is planned to be, for July 1st. And then I've just outlined a basic timeline so people can understand what's happening. So between February 6th and March 19th, all the states are working on their applications. From March 20th to April 15th, we're going to have an eligibility and technical review, and then, if necessary, any revisions by the applicants. Then from mid-April to mid-May, there's a programmatic review and a recommendation for award from the Assistant Secretary of NTIA. And then between May and July, the grants office takes the application package and turns it into a grant award with the special award conditions, with the terms and conditions, and the appropriate citations to the OMB circulars. So if you go to the next slide, the eligible applicants for this grant program are the 56 state and territories. Each state and territory must submit an individual application, and the states and territories may collaborate or coordinate with other states or regions in preparing the application, but in order to receive grant funds, the states need to have their own individual application. If you go to the next slide, slide 8, I think this is an important statutory requirement that I explained to this group today. The Act does mandate that each governor or executive of the state designate a single officer or governmental body to serve as the coordinator of the implementation funds for SLIG-P. Additionally, that single point of contact is responsible for the consultation with FirstNet. The states must provide information about the state government agency and where the officer is employed in their application. And the designated person must be a current government employee, not a contractor or consultant. If the state designates a governmental body such as the Statewide Interoperability Executive Committee, that entity must have legal authority to receive and expend funds on behalf of the state, and they also need to still identify a single point of contact within that government body to coordinate with. So it could be the chairperson or an executive director or the statewide interoperability coordinator, but there's still a single point of contact. And I think it's important, I'm just going to just move away from my slide for a moment to say that the statute is requiring that local, tribal, regional bodies work through this single point of contact to consult with FirstNet on the network. So I know that we're going to get a lot of questions about that, but the statute was set up for this single point of contact for both the grant funds and the consultation with FirstNet. So it's an important piece to kind of, we'll probably get to that more in questions and answers. If you go to slide 9, I've talked about the funding distribution. So NTIA will be awarding $121.5 million. It's a formula-based matching grant program, each state and territory. So in order to come up with the formula, we used 3 factors. The first factor was every state got a minimum allocation of $500,000, and then the remaining funds were distributed among 2 weighted factors, 75% towards population and 25% towards land mass of the state or territory. The maximum award is $6 million. The minimum award is actually $515,000 for some of the territories. NTIA will reserve 50% of the funds through a special award condition for use in the Phase 2 activities. So I'll explain the phases, but the program is established in 2 different phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. So if you go to the next slide, slide 10, there is a matching requirement for this grant program. The federal share may not exceed 80% of the eligible grant costs, and the non-federal share must be at least 20% of the total eligible costs. The match can be cash, allowable in-kind contributions, or indirect costs. The statute does provide the Assistant Secretary authority to waive in whole or in part the matching requirement for good cause or in the public interest. I think it's important for the applicants to know that the Assistant Secretary does not intend to consider any waivers unless there are extraordinary circumstances. So in the FFO, you can look at the federal and the non-federal amounts, and it's the opinion of the Assistant Secretary that all of the match requirements over the 3-year period of performance are very doable for each of the states. And so at this point, he does not intend to waive any of the match requirements. If you go to the next slide, the allowable grant activities under the program. So in the first phase, this is a really important part of the program where the states will be planning, consulting with FirstNet, and engaging with all of the stakeholders. So the allowable activities will be to establish or enhance an existing governance structure, to consult with FirstNet, and to incorporate broadband, to develop procedures to ensure local and tribal representation is accounted for when the state is consulting with FirstNet. It's to conduct education and outreach with all the relevant stakeholders, and this includes state-level agencies, local jurisdictions, tribal nations, regional bodies, as well as all of the public safety disciplines, fire, police, EMS, sheriff, public safety answering points, all of them. I can't list them all, but all of the different public safety stakeholders. This will also be the phase where the state will work to identify the potential public safety users for the nationwide network. There's also the ability to develop standard memorandums of agreement in order to help facilitate the possible sharing of infrastructure with FirstNet. This is the staffing plans to involve local and tribal stakeholders in the development of requirements, the consultation with FirstNet, as well as the data collection that will be required in Phase 2. And then preparing a comprehensive plan as part of the Statewide Communication Interoperability Plan, so the SCIP, or a plan that's complementary or similar to the SCIP that describes the public safety needs that each state expects FirstNet to address, plus the relevant milestones. If you go to slide 12, the second phase of funding, this phase is going to be where states focus on primarily the collection requests, the collecting requested data for FirstNet. This is the phase where 50% of the funds are held aside, and we're holding them until FirstNet knows what data elements they need from each of the states, localities, and tribes, and in what format FirstNet needs that data. Once they inform NTIA of those data needs, then we can request a revised budget and a revised project description in order to release the second phase of funding. So then, just to be clear, we're not necessarily assuming that Phase 1 is in sequence. Phase 1 and Phase 2 are sequenced. Phase 1 may last for the 3-year period of performance, and Phase 2 might come somewhere in the middle. It could come sooner as well, but Phase 2 might be going on simultaneously with Phase 1. But we won't release Phase 2 until we know what the data requirements are. So if you go to the next slide, slide 13, eligible costs. So this grant program pays for the personnel costs, including hiring staff and consultants. The cost for planning meetings can pay for travel costs, and this is the travel cost for state-level employees as well as tribal and local representatives that need to be going to planning meetings or in order to have good participation in the governance bodies. The costs for developing, modifying, and enhancing statewide plans and governance structures are eligible. Costs to conduct communication, education, and outreach activities, again, to all of the stakeholders at a state, local, tribal level, as well as all the public safety disciplines. This could be the cost to identify the potential public safety users for the network. Administrative and legal services, training costs, and then any reasonable cost to prepare the application, as well as pre-award expenses for states and territories to participate in the FirstNet technical assistance workshops that may occur before the July 15th award date. If you go to the next slide, the ineligible costs. So SLIG funds may not be used for the following activities. This is a planning grant program, so you can't do site preparation, broadband deployment or installation, construction, or the acquisition of equipment used for the provision of broadband services. So this is not a program where you'll be prepping towers, deploying or constructing any part of a network. This is the planning and governance portion of the process. So these are not eligible federal not eligible use for federal funds or non-federal funds. So if you go to the next slide on the application, all applications must be submitted on March 19th. The complete application package will include the following items. It will include the 424 family, so 424, 424A, and 424B. It'll have the Department of Commerce lobbying certification, the standard disclosure of lobbying activities. Then there's going to be 3 parts, the project feasibility, which is a brief 2-page narrative on the state's or territory's capacity and knowledge and staffing plan in order to accomplish the goals of the program. Then the supplemental application narrative, which I'm going to get to in just a moment on the next slide. But it's the supplemental application narrative is 15 sections of questions and about 40 sub-questions that the states have to respond to. There'll be a detailed budget justification. And then the final piece is that letter of state designation where the governor or the governor's designee identifies the single officer or governmental body to serve as the coordinator of the funds and take responsibility for the consultation with FirstNet. And the applications may be easily submitted on grants.gov. So if you go to slide 16, we have the evaluation criteria. So project feasibility, the 2-page brief summary is 5 points of the total score of 100. The detailed budget justification is 20 points. And then the bulk of the points of the 100-point score is the supplemental application narrative. That's worth 75 points. So I just want to focus for a moment on the different sections of the narrative so that people understand what the states are putting together. And I think it's important to realize that a big portion of this grant is the engagement and coordination with the stakeholders that the state point of contact needs to represent. So a lot of this supplemental application narrative is around getting at what's the plan that the state has to engage the stakeholders. That does not necessarily mean that the state will be engaging with all of the stakeholders during the application phase, but it does mean once the grants are awarded in mid-July, the states have to have a plan on how they're going to reach all of the state-level agencies, the local jurisdictions, all of the tribal nations, as well as all of the public safety disciplines across the state or territory. So if you break down kind of what's in the application narrative section, the existing governance body, that's really talking about the existing interoperability governance bodies, the SIGBs or the SIECs, whatever your state has, but what's the organizational structure and the membership, what's the authority for this body to make decisions regarding public safety communications? How does the state plan to leverage its governance body or the equivalent to coordinate the implementation of the SLIG grant program and the public safety broadband network? How does the state plan to expand its existing governance structure to include additional representatives who understand LTE technology or wireless broadband? And then a little bit about the state's sufficiency of funding for the governance body. How is, what's the financial situation of the governance body? Does the state intend to invest funds received by SLIG-P, and those types of things? When you look at the statewide communication interoperability plan, or the SCIP section, this is talking about what's the strategic goals of the SCIP, how are you incorporating public safety wireless broadband, how does the state engage local and tribal nations, does the state intend to use the SLIG-P funds to support efforts in updating the SCIP? So it's essentially the plan. Then we have the three different components: state-level involvement, coordination with local jurisdictions, and regional coordination. These are all questions that are going to be focused on identify who are the state, local, or regional bodies. How do you involve the state, local, or regional bodies? What's the method that you have successfully coordinated with those bodies in the past, and what are the challenges that you've encountered, and how do you plan to overcome those challenges in this grant program? And so at this point, if you can turn to the next slide, what I've done is I've outlined slide 17, the tribal supplemental narrative questions. Since that's the audience that is on the phone today, I thought it would be important to see the questions that the states have to answer. So the first part is, how many federally recognized tribes are located within the state boundaries? We did provide them a link from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to ensure that what we're looking at and what they're reporting are the same, and if there's discrepancies, they explain those. We asked them to describe how the state will involve the tribal nations to ensure there's adequate representation of their interests in the FirstNet consultation and in the planning and governance process with the grant program. We asked them, does the state have a process for consulting with the tribes located within the state boundaries, and if so, provide a description of that process. They need to describe past methods that they've used to successfully coordinate with tribal nations. And then, are there tribal representatives who regularly attend those governance body meetings? And if so, identify the tribal representatives. And that does not necessarily mean by name, but simply by identification of tribe. And what have been some of the state's primary challenges while engaging with the tribal nations, and what are the strategies that the state will employ to overcome those challenges during this implementation grant program, as well as through the consultation with FirstNet? So those are the questions that the state has to respond in order to talk to us about how they're engaging with the tribes and what's their plan of activities to ensure that the tribes have adequate representation in this consultation process. If we go to the next slide, we outline the application review process. So we have had a call for reviewers that closed yesterday, but we have received enormous response from federal, state, local, and tribal public safety and government employees who want to be peer reviewers for these applications. What we'll be doing is assigning those volunteers to review the applications. We'll ensure there's no conflict of interest, and we'll ensure that no peer reviewer works in a state that they are employed or have been employed. But the applications will be assessed by 3 reviewers, and it will be based on a points-based system. So the 100 points that I was talking about before, 5 points for the project feasibility, 75 points for the supplemental application narrative, and 20 points for the budget justification. those will be the 100-point scale, and then each of the sub-elements of the supplemental application narrative will have a scoring system as well. And so what we intend to do is collect all the scores. If the average score is above 70, then the state application can move forward for the programmatic review. If it's below 70, then we'll take the peer review comments and send it back to the state for revision and to address any deficiencies. Also, if there's a 20-point variance between any two reviewers, so if one reviewer scores the application at a 90 and one scores at a 70, what we'll do is we'll get all of the reviewers on the phone and just have an open discussion about why they scored the way they did, and see how to remedy the situation with a revision of the application. And so that will be the peer review process. If you go to the next slide, I just give a little bit more about the peer reviewers that we've been working to recruit and then hopefully select. They needed to be knowledgeable about public safety communications or have experience with public safety IT, a first responder experienced in public safety communications, an elected or appointed official knowledgeable about public safety communications, or a program manager or grants manager experienced in public safety communications. They have to be government employees, so we're not taking consultants or contractors, and the reviewers will not be compensated, so they will be volunteer, and they must sign both a conflict of interest as well as a confidentiality form. So if you go to the next slide, there will be quarterly reports that each recipient has to do. It's a progress report and a financial report. There will also be a closeout report within 90 days of the award end date. And then that first bullet is what I should talk about, which is within 30 to 45 calendar days after award, the recipients or the states and territories will need to submit to NTIA the baseline expenditure plan for the entire period of performance. And this is where the actual plan is set up. So if a state told in their application that they have 15 state-level agencies, that they have 3 tribal nations, that they have 72 counties or municipalities, and they have 2 regional bodies. That would be their characterization of their state. Now in the baseline expenditure plan, they need to speak to how they're going to do their outreach and education activities with respect to those different entities. So how are you going to reach with the 15 different state-level agencies? How are you going to engage with the 3 tribal nations? How are you going to work with your 70-plus local jurisdictions, et cetera? So the application is the state's opportunity to describe their state and the dynamics within their state with respect to state-level agencies, localities, tribal nations, as well as regional bodies, and also, I didn't focus on it, but the rurality of the state, because that's an important component of both the planning process as well as the FirstNet deployment, with the need for FirstNet to have substantial rural coverage milestones in the deployment phases. The planning process for rural is very important. So this baseline expenditure plan is the state's activities to address those stakeholders, to do MOAs, to hold planning meetings, to enhance their governance structures. So they'll have their activities planned, and then by quarter, how do they intend to meet those activities, as well as what is their expenditure plan of federal and non-federal funds by quarter throughout the period of performance. So it's an important report that the states will have to work on right after they get their award. If you go to next slide, I just have the resources that are available to review on our website. We've got the Federal Funding Opportunity Notice, the Supplemental Application Narrative Questions, the Frequently Asked Questions, as well as a press release. The grants.gov has assistance in completing applications. So for the state entities, there's guidance there. And then there is a general email box that we are taking questions, as well as a general phone number. And then if you just go to the last slide, I have my information, my direct phone number, and my direct email if anybody has questions. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you now and see what questions we have.
All right, thank you, Laura. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box, and I can read them over the phone. Or if you would like your line to be unmuted, I can also do that if you select the raise your hand option. And I don't see any questions being asked now, but I do have a couple of questions for you, Laura.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you covered this in your presentation, but is there a deadline for when the peer reviewers will be selected?
So we received the peer reviewer resumes, and we're going through them over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then we would expect the probably by the end, March 22nd is when we're targeting to have the selection done, as well as to start to schedule training webinars and slate the peer reviewers into panels and assign them to applications. So we're expecting essentially at the end of the 3rd week in March to have all the assignments made.
All right, thank you. And we also have a question submitted. They're asking that basically only people who can submit for an application are from the states, correct?
That's correct. The statute was really clear that the grant program is to the 56 states and territories, and that the governor needs to appoint a single point of designation at the state level.
And as a follow-up question, they're wondering how this will directly benefit tribal nations.
The grant program or the nationwide network, or both?
The grant network and both.
Okay. So the grant program, what I'll say is it's not a lot of money. When you divide it by 56 states and territories, and then you divide it over 3 years, many of the state allocations are, less than the average allocation is about $2 million. But half of the states are well below that, and then half of the states are above it. So the planning dollars are really an important piece in order to ensure that the stakeholders understand what the nationwide network is about, make sure that their public safety needs and requirements are fed up through the state point of contact, that when we do the data collection, if there's infrastructure that the states, locals, or tribes are interested in contributing to the network, or interested in doing a leasing arrangement with FirstNet or something that would help benefit the nationwide network, that information is fed and gets back to FirstNet so that they can design the nationwide architecture as well as the nationwide network to incorporate the existing infrastructure that's out there as well as the needs of the public safety community. So the importance of the planning grant program, and specifically for the tribes to be involved, is to make sure that the needs and the complexities are fed to, that there's a good dialogue about what the conditions and the problems are, so that they can be kind of put into the matrix that FirstNet is designing for how to do this network, and then ensure that the tribes are not left behind with this nationwide network. Now, what I'll say is that there's no direct money to the tribes. States can sub-grant their awards to allow for positions or recovering of travel or planning costs. But again, states don't have a lot of allocation, but it is an allowable activity to sub-grant some of the funds if there's more need to get local and tribal engagement into the state process. With that said, FirstNet is intending to put together a tribal outreach program that will be directed at the tribes in order to get the tribes to engage directly with FirstNet. That program will not involve funds directly to tribes, but it will involve outreach so that the tribes do have some vehicle in order to speak to FirstNet and communicate their needs to FirstNet directly. What I'll say is that FirstNet right now is a board of directors. They don't have any federal staff yet. They only have some small consultancy contracts. And so it's going to take them a little time to put together their staffing as well as their approach to the outreach. But they do intend to have a tribal outreach plan.
Okay, and the next question I have is a two-part question. First part being, will government cuts affect this grant program?
So in all likelihood, the government cuts will in some way impact this grant program. We don't know exactly the plan. We don't have an approved sequestration plan. So we're waiting for that to be signed by the President and then for the Office of Management and Budget to approve the sequestration plan. But I think it's fair to say that there will be some impact to this program, and the biggest impact will be reduction in the award amounts to the states and territories. But I don't have many more details other than if it's impacted and it's not, and sequestration is not fixed, then in all likelihood the award amounts will be reduced.
Okay, and the second part of the question was, how does this fit into Homeland Security dollars available to tribes for building out public safety networks? Will FirstNet coordinate with DHS, or is this kind of a standalone independent initiative?
So I mean, we're certainly, and FirstNet is certainly working with DHS, but DHS is deferring. So the piece about building out public safety communications infrastructure, there will still be a need for land mobile radio, mission critical voice communications. And it's not, the LTE broadband technology at this time does not support mission critical voice capability. So the funding that tribes and other jurisdictions get for their land mobile radio or mission critical voice systems will still be necessary and still be working, moving forward. Whether DHS decides to fund any public safety broadband deployments is still under review, but it's my understanding that they are not going to be giving a lot of funds for wireless broadband solutions for public safety recipients, because the single license for this spectrum is given to FirstNet at a nationwide level, so that they don't want to be spending funds to build networks that won't be able to be turned on because there's no license for that spectrum. But where, for instance, someone wants to build in the 4.9 gigahertz or the 2.9 gigahertz, those projects can probably still move forward because tribes can, and localities and states can get spectrum for that. So, so these will be coordinated. It does not mean that the funding from DHS is going to be is not going to be there. I think it will be, but it will, in all likelihood, not focus on broadband and instead focus on LMR voice, mission critical voice communications.
Okay. Sorry, we had a little bit of technical difficulty there, but
no problem.
Laura, are you still there?
Yes.
All right. We have another question regarding the supplemental application narrative. You had mentioned that it was 75 points total, and there's a whole list of different factors that must be taken into account for that particular narrative. Will tribal involvement be only worth 5 points for the submittal? And there's kind of a concern that states would still move forward without tribal input.
They might pass the peer review process, but there's no way that they pass the NTIA federal programmatic process. If they have tribes within their state territory and they don't have a plan to engage and conduct outreach with those tribes, they will not meet the programmatic requirements, and that will be essentially deficient, and it will have to be revised. So if there's identified tribes within a state maybe from a points perspective, they can get through the peer review process, but there's no likelihood that that will pass through the programmatic review.
All right, thank you. And another question we have is, what is the likelihood that FirstNet will become available for use by other non-public safety-related entities? For instance, use as in remote healthcare networks and distance learning initiatives?
So what I'll have to say is I don't have the answer to that yet. I think FirstNet ultimately has to determine what's allowable under the statute and then what's feasible with the $7 million that's been allocated. So that, I would say, is to be determined, but I know it's going to be an issue that they have to look at from both a statutory perspective as well as a sustainability perspective of the network.
All right, thank you. And another question we have is, will the states be planning for the tribes and FirstNet deployment, or will tribes be involved and responsible for its own planning?
So I think it's important to realize that FirstNet is responsible for the plans associated with the nationwide network. This isn't a network of networks where everybody is building out their own network. FirstNet is responsible for taking all actions necessary to design, deploy, construct, and operate a nationwide network. So what the states are doing with the planning and engaging with the stakeholders is essentially looking at how do you incorporate broadband into the public safety culture, what will be the standard operating procedures, what does it mean to have local control, how does this work in the state. They won't be planning on how they're going to build their own network. The same as the tribes won't be building their own network. But as it relates to planning for how they're going to integrate broadband, how they're going to use broadband, who are the users, that's where the planning comes in. But it's not a planning grant for everybody to plan their own deployment of a separate network. This is a nationwide network. So maybe I just misunderstood the question, but it's certainly not everybody's doing their own planning for their own networks.
All right, thank you. Another question we had that was submitted was, and I believe this is in reference to the FirstNet board. The question is, if a tribal nation wanted someone on FirstNet, how would they go about getting that person nominated and selected?
Sure. So the board members are appointed to 1-, 2-, and 3-year terms. There is an opportunity to renew the terms, but it depends on whether the board member wants to and whether the Secretary of Commerce will reappoint that person. But when an opening on the board comes up, NTIA will go through the same open recruitment process that we went through the first time. So we will put an advertisement in the Federal Register notice. We will put a letter together for interested parties, and then it will go through. The applicants will have to put forward a resume and a statement of interest and the other components of an application, and then there'll be a review and interview process and then an actual appointment process. But that will be open and available to anyone who meets the criteria that was outlined in the original statute.
All right, thank you. And another question we have is leasing of existing or planned tribal communications towers likely to leverage existing infrastructure in reaching rural communities?
Certainly, it's a very big possibility that some of the tribal infrastructure would be in the more rural areas, and certainly we don't want to duplicate infrastructure that exists. So where there's a possibility of getting access to existing infrastructure, that's something that we're going to be looking at in the grant program through the data collection process, as well as FirstNet will be doing through their consultation. Now, the piece that I know is a concern for many local and state agencies, and probably for some of the tribal nations, is getting a FirstNet or a private sector employee access to the site, because they're ultimately responsible for the operations and maintenance of the nationwide network. And so what we're struggling with, or what we're dealing with, and that's one of the reasons that we've opened the allowability for looking at what standard memorandum of understandings or agreements would be, is in order to understand what are the possibilities with respect to getting access to the sites, to ease the burden of doing individual agreements for all 20,000 sites that exist with public safety across the country. So yes, it's a very big possibility, and it's certainly would help with the rural coverage. And then it would be, what are the details, and can we work out the details of an agreement?
All right, thank you. And I would just like to ask something in follow-up to that.
Sure.
In terms of if you're not going to be leasing existing cell tower infrastructure and instead deploying new infrastructure, what kind of regulation will you go through in terms of working with tribes on tribal lands? For instance, like, are you going to be working with the FCC to kind of go through that form of regulation in cell tower placement?
Yeah, so I mean, FirstNet is subject to NEPA and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, as well as Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. So it would go through the same review and the same requirements that any new infrastructure used with federal funds would have to go through.
All right, thank you. And next question we have is, and just to provide a little background on this question, you had mentioned that phase 1 of this grant program would only be $121.5 million. What will happen if a state doesn't get funding? What will happen in terms of tribes within those states if they're not included in the planning process?
It's a great question. So the $121.5 million is the total allocation for the full program, and that is divided 50% for phase 1 and 50% for phase 2. You know, certainly if a state decides not to participate in the planning grants, and that's their right, they don't have to apply for funds. We still don't have the statutory authority to then grant that money to a locality or a tribe, because the statute was really clear that the only eligible entities are the states and territories. So in that situation where a state has decided we're not going to participate in the planning process, then I think NTIA and FirstNet will have to develop a strategy in order to engage those stakeholders in the state, because at the end of the day, the network is to benefit public safety at all levels, not just the state. So that's going to impact the localities in that state. It's going to impact the tribal nations and any of the regional bodies, as well as the rural aspects of that state. So if a state decides not to participate, they're really putting their stakeholders at a disadvantage, and we'll have to figure out what we do in order to help compensate for that. But it does not mean that I can then go and grant to a locality or a tribe, because I don't have the statutory authority to do that.
All right, thank you. Next question we have relates to the Stafford Act. With the changes in the Stafford Act and FEMA and emergency declarations by tribes, instead of through tribes, how will FirstNet be used if a state doesn't want to cooperate?
You know, I'm not as familiar with those changes, so I couldn't comment on that.
Well, basically the Stafford Act, just to provide a little background, the Stafford Act allows tribes to make emergency declarations directly to the president. Previously, the legislation was set up to where states had to contact their tribes had to contact their respective state governors to request a declaration of emergency. Instead, kind of bypasses that state, going through the state and instead going directly to the president. So in terms of looking to the future for FirstNet deployment, how will tribes be more involved if they're able to make declarations directly to the president for an emergency declaration but still lack that emergency communications?
I'm honestly not sure how the two are related. Emergency declarations are not necessarily related to FirstNet directly. That doesn't mean that once the network is deployed, there won't be some additional work needed for when a disaster is declared. But I don't think the two are related for a planning process of a nationwide network. So either I'm not understanding the connection or it's not relevant at this time because an emergency declaration now will not do, it doesn't change anything that FirstNet does.
All right, and we can also do any additional follow-up regarding that question. I will have all of the questions archived that are being asked in this webinar session, and I will share them with yourself at NTIA, and hopefully we can get some of these questions that perhaps we're either not able to get to or you're not able to answer right now.
Okay, great.
And okay, so the next question we have is related to the FirstNet board, and they were wondering if the FirstNet board has anyone knowledgeable of tribal lands and tribal interests regarding public safety communications.
Well, we have a number of different state representatives that there to represent state, local, and tribal interests. The board member who's most engaged and most knowledgeable is the Wellington Webb, who's a former mayor of Denver, and he, if you've watched any of the board meetings, has typically talked about the tribal interests and the tribal engagement. Additionally, Tim Bryan, who does a lot of rural, and some of the rural interests, is quite knowledgeable about tribes. And so those are the two members that come to mind, but I know that there's a number who have some background or some knowledge of working with tribes.
And just as follow-up, so there is currently not a tribal representative on the FirstNet board.
Yeah, no. The statute requires 3 representatives that will work on the collective interests of states, locals, and tribes, but there's no requirement in the statute to have a specific tribal representative, a specific local representative, or a specific state representative. So it's slightly different than having a tribal representative on every board.
Okay, and again, if you have any further questions, please use your questions box and type it in there, or I can unmute your line if you use the raise your hand option if you would like to ask your question over the phone. And just to give people a little extra time on that, I have a couple of follow-up questions as well.
Sure.
So again, realizing that this is a limited number of funds, how will tribes know if their particular state is applying for the grant program? Is there a certain individual that will contact them, or is there a way that tribes can go to NTIA or their respective states to find that information out currently?
So not currently. I don't have a list of the single points of contact. Once we receive the applications, then we will have the single points of contact as designated by the governor. Once we make all of the awards, we will post all of the applications online so it's publicly available for everybody to review. Again, the engagement with the state level agencies, the localities, and the tribal nations will really plan to start in the mid-July timeframe once the award is made. Although the states are certainly more than welcome and encouraged to contact all of the stakeholders in advance or during this application period, there's actually not a lot of time. This application was only open for about 40 days. And so we realized the states cannot get to all of the stakeholders in a meaningful engagement. And the funding, when the funding becomes available, that is when tribes will both have the information of who the single point of contact is, as well as expect to be contacted and engaged on this program.
Okay, thank you. And I had another question regarding, again, the application process where states are to specify in their narrative that they hold consultations with tribes in their, within their states. Will there be some type of review process that'll kind of acknowledge that that actually occurs? So, for instance, say the Gila River Indian community in Arizona, Arizona submits its application and states, yes, we do hold consultations with Gila River. Will there be any type of fact-checking in that way? Will NTIA look to contact Gila River if, to kind of, again, clarify that that actually does occur?
So there will be oversight and monitoring of the awards. I don't know that our monitoring plan right now has any verification of the tribal engagement. What I will say is that NTIA will have program staff that are dedicated to a region of the country. So they'll have 4 program officers, and they will be responsible for monitoring and providing technical assistance for a state. Those names and those regional contacts will be available and posted online. And if a tribe is having problems getting meaningful engagements, NTIA is more than welcome to try and figure out what's going on in order to help facilitate a better consultation and a better interaction with the tribe. So, you know, if you're finding that there's a problem, you know, certainly don't, you know, speak up and let us know. There's also, we have a tribal liaison with the Department of Commerce who is engaged on this program, and you know, there's an avenue through her as well, Dee Alexander. So, you know, there's a number of different ways that we can interact with the tribes if there are problems, because we are well aware of the government-to-government relationship, and we want to make sure that we both comply with the statute as well as ensure that the tribes are not left out of this program.
All right, thank you. And we have another question that was submitted. If this grant program is not applied for and accepted by a state, will they still be able to obtain funds in future years as FirstNet is implemented?
So FirstNet has the funds to build out the nationwide network. FirstNet will not be giving funds to states to build out the network. If a state decides to opt out and build their own radio access network, then the state, if they want funds, will need to come to NTIA to seek a grant for the construction of the radio access network, and it will still be part of the nationwide network. But if the state does not opt out, then FirstNet will use the funds available to build out the network. So there is no subsequent grant program for the states to build the network. It's only in the situation where they decide they don't want to participate in the FirstNet build-out plan. So essentially, the network will be built by FirstNet through RFPs to private sector entities. That's the way the statute outlines it. If a state is not happy with the plan of how it's going to be built, they can come in and apply for grant funds, as well as put forward a formal plan to the FCC that has to be approved, and then the state can move forward with construction of a radio access network. But at this point, it's not conceived that there's another grant program that FirstNet makes grants to states.
Okay, thank you. And the next question we have is, if the state doesn't apply for this grant at this time, does that mean that the state will be expected or automatically opted out of FirstNet deployment?
No, absolutely not. FirstNet needs to build a nationwide public safety broadband network. FirstNet, under the statute, must consult with the state point of contact, and the state point of contact needs to have the interest of the state's local, tribal, and regional bodies. What it means if the state decides not to apply for planning funds is that they'll have to do that consultation with FirstNet. They just won't have the funds to build up their staff and to get good outreach with their stakeholders. But the consultation with FirstNet still is required. So it's whether they apply for the funds to have some federal support in doing that planning process, but the consultation still has to take place. And the opt-out decision is a separate decision later once FirstNet has their design as well as has completed their request for proposal process.
All right, thank you. The next question is related to the, and perhaps you can kind of specify the eligible costs of the grant program again. But the next question is related to if tribes lack access to the proposed LTE network and individuals on the reservation will not have state-of-the-art connection for first responder needs, how will the next phase of the initiative help connect these unserved areas for broadband service?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I think this kind of has to play with the eligible costs for the grant program, but the question states, how will the next phase of this initiative help connect unserved communities for broadband?
So I think this is important to realize that this is a planning grant program. So actually connecting, doing site preparation, construction, broadband deployment, broadband installation, or acquisition of equipment for the provision of broadband services are not allowable under this grant program. So this grant program will not connect broadband to underserved areas of the country.
Okay, and another question we have is related to FirstNet deployment when it occurs. How will private contractors come on the tribal lands to build this network if tribal inclusion is not made?
So I think this is going to be a big issue, not just with tribes, but certainly it's going to be a larger issue with tribal nations in ensuring that the work gets done for how the private sector entities can come and build on tribal lands in order to ensure that there's access to tribal public safety to the network. But that's going to be something that FirstNet has to work out in both its consultation as well as its network design. But if at the end of the day the tribe doesn't want construction or fiber or microwave backhaul and there's no existing infrastructure and they don't want a private sector entity to build broadband facilities on their land, then I think that will be a problem and something that will need to be worked out.
All right, thank you. And just as follow-up to that, I had a question regarding one of the resolutions that was passed last year by the FirstNet board where they created a consultation committee. I was wondering when their report will be released and if it will be released for public comment.
I guess I'm not sure which resolution you're referring to.
Well, it's the creation of a consultation committee for state, regional, local, and tribal. They were supposed to develop a consultation plan for FirstNet deployment.
So what they have developed, and I'd have to go back and read the specific resolution, is they have the user advocacy, the acting user advocacy officer, which is Chief Jeff Johnson, and he is charged with putting together the stakeholder outreach plan. And he, in the last board meeting, presented a presentation on a high-level review of where they're going with their outreach. I don't believe that they ever formed a formal technical subcommittee or a consultation subcommittee.
All right, and the next question we have is, we've heard that coverage will extend to every square meter of the country. Does this include the most remote native villages and corners of the state of Alaska?
So I think that's to be determined. I think the intent is to get ubiquitous coverage across the country, understanding that public safety needs to serve all areas. I think I don't have the answer as to what is the business plan, what are the phased approaches, and what FirstNet can afford with the $7 billion. So I don't have an answer, but I know that the intent is to try and get ubiquitous coverage. I think the plan for how to do that is still under development.
All right, thank you. And the next question we have, is FirstNet prepared to pay lease values to utilize tribal land at fair market value?
You know, I can't speculate on what FirstNet intends to do with leasing arrangements, but I mean, that's something that they will have to work out with the owners of the infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And let me just look and see if there's any other questions here.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, we have another question regarding the opt-out procedure for FirstNet. If a state opts in or opts out, how will unserved areas for broadband get access to FirstNet network?
So the way the opt-out works or opt-in works is that FirstNet needs to complete their request for proposals, and then they need to write a letter to the governor that essentially says three things. They're complete with their RFP. They've completed their RFP process. They need to outline their plan for each of the states, and then NTIA outlines the funding level that each of the states will receive under the FirstNet plan. That plan that they present to the governor outlines what will be served and how it will be served. And so that's what they're committing to doing. That is when the governor gets to decide whether they opt in or opt out based on that plan. If they opt out and the state decides to build their own radio access network, they're going to have a comparable plan with respect to coverage, resiliency, redundancy, and hardening, and a whole bunch of other elements that go into putting together an FCC plan to approved opt-out. So, you know, that plan that FirstNet gives to the governor should outline how they're going to serve the state.
All right, thank you. And again, if you have any further questions, please use the questions box and type them in there, or use the raise hand option on your control panel to signal me to unmute your line. I had another question regarding the grant program and how states can jointly apply for the program, in terms of how will regional states that are applying together ensure that tribes are included? Will the application specify a single point of contact for that regional area, or will each state still have its own single point of contact?
I think I'm understanding the question, but I'm not sure. The state has to designate a single point of contact for each state that will then represent the state, local, tribal, and regional bodies. Does that answer the question, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting to.
Okay.
All right, and the next question we have is, will the opt-out period, and I'm assuming this is in relation to FirstNet, the federal RFP process, will the opt-out period be as short as this short application period?
So the governor, when the FirstNet sends the state the plan, the opt-in, opt-out plan, the governor has 90 days to decide whether they opt in or opt out.
And as follow-up, at the end of that 90 days, once or if a state decides to opt out, how long will they have then to develop their own RFP to submit to the FCC?
So the statute outlines that once the governor opts out, the state has 180 days to do essentially 3 things: to start and complete the RFP process, to develop a plan that the FCC has to approve, and they need to come to NTIA to get a lease on the spectrum. The 4th thing, which is optional, is the state can come to NTIA to seek grant funds to construct the radio access network. But the statute outlines that the state will have 180 days from the point of opt-out in order to complete those things.
All right, thank you. And I believe we are nearing the end of the presentation, so I will go ahead and close this out. But
I have one more comment that I forgot to mention, but I did want to mention to the group, which is FirstNet has a public safety advisory committee that was just formed and formalized. And the National Congress of American Indians does have a role in the Public Safety Advisory Committee. And so one of the aspects of the PSAC is to ensure that public safety needs, as well as the stakeholders, state, local, and then tribal, have input into FirstNet. And so the PSAC is an advisory committee to FirstNet, and there is an avenue through that body in order for tribes to have their voice heard.
All right, thank you. And yes, just as follow-up, NCAI does have a tribal representative on the Public Safety Advisory Committee. If you would like more information on that point of contact, please don't hesitate to contact myself or anyone here at NCAI. My contact information is, email is bhoward@ncai.org. That's B as in boy, HOWARD @ncai.org. And just as follow-up, this webinar has been recorded, and we will post it online for viewing, and I will send out the link to view it to everyone that's attended and also registered for the webinar, so you can also share with any of your other tribal entities that would be interested in learning more about this program. If you have any further questions, again, you can contact myself or Laura, and we will be sending out, in addition to a link to the recording, we will be sending out the PDF slide deck. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone that attended, and looking forward to moving this on. Laura, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just, Brian, thank you to you and your colleagues for arranging this call. We really appreciate the opportunity to reach out to your stakeholders, and this, I would say, is a start to many conversations that we'll have over the next few months as well as years.
All right, thank you. Everyone have a nice day.